The rolling hills of Virginia in 1834 looked serene to any traveler passing through. Fields of tobacco swayed under the sun. White-painted farmhouses sat proudly on patches of fertile land, and smoke curled lazily from chimneys as families gathered for supper. But beneath that picture of southern gentility, whispers moved like shadows. Tales were told of children who vanished on their way to school, of orphans who disappeared before reaching the charity homes, of strangers last seen walking near the old Sullivan estate. Most dismissed these stories as superstition, cruel rumors spun by rival farmers or restless slaves. But the truth, when it finally broke into the light, was far darker than anyone dared to imagine. The Sullivan family had long been pillars of respectability. Thomas Sullivan, stern and commanding, was known as a man of means. He owned fertile acres and boasted of connections in Richmond. His wife, Eleanor, presented herself as a devout mother, often seen at church in lace bonnets. Her children pressed and polished in the pew beside her. To neighbors, the Sullivans seemed blessed, wealthy, pious, and untouched by the troubles that plagued less fortunate households. Yet their estate was always guarded, their servants strangely tight-lipped, and travelers often remarked that the family kept to themselves more than was natural. The house itself was old, built of brick with black shutters and a cellar door sunk deep into the earth. Few outsiders ever entered beyond the parlor, where portraits of solemn ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following visitors with an almost accusing glare. Behind those walls, behind the heavy curtains that kept the sunlight from reaching inside, lay secrets no one could have believed until the day they were uncovered. The first official suspicion fell upon the Sullivans when a farmhand from a neighboring property claimed to have heard cries carried on the night air. He swore the voices belonged to children, thin, frightened wails that rose and fell with the wind. At first, his story was dismissed. After all, coyotes roamed the woods, and a man's imagination could play cruel tricks in the dark. But soon others began to murmur of the same sounds. Some claimed they had seen small faces peering from cracks in the Sullivan cellar door, pale and desperate. A traveling preacher, passing through, even spoke in his sermon of evil festering in the soil of this valley. Still, no one acted. Fear and respect held the community in check. The Sullivans were too powerful, their wealth and their standing in the church too strong to question openly. To accuse them would have been social suicide. Better to bury suspicions than risk the wrath of a family whose influence reached judges and sheriffs alike. It was only when a young boy named Samuel vanished that things began to unravel. He had been sent to fetch water from the creek, but never returned. Search parties scoured the woods, the riverbanks, even the road leading out of town, but no trace was found. His mother swore she heard his voice calling from beneath the earth near the Sullivan farm. Desperate and half-mad with grief, she forced her way onto the estate, screaming that her son was inside. Neighbors pulled her away, but her cries planted a seed of doubt in the community. That doubt grew when two men, emboldened by drink and suspicion, broke into the Sullivan cellar one night. They carried lanterns and clubs, expecting to find perhaps a stash of stolen goods or contraband whiskey. What they found instead was horror beyond comprehension. Rows of iron chains bolted to stone walls, each link rattling with the faintest movement. Dozens of children, skeletal and wide-eyed, sat huddled in the dark, their skin marked by bruises and welts. Some were so weak they could barely lift their heads. Others shrank from the light, as though they had lived too long without it. The men fled in terror, their screams waking the entire valley. By dawn, a mob had gathered at the Sullivan house. They dragged open the cellar doors and revealed the nightmare to all. 47 children, some missing for months, others for years, were pulled from the darkness. The sight of them, gaunt and shivering, silenced even the loudest voices. No one could explain how such cruelty had existed in their midst, hidden in plain sight behind the facade of respectability. When confronted, Thomas Sullivan remained stoic, his jaw set like stone. Eleanor wept, but her tears felt strange and hollow, as if she grieved not for the children, but for the ruin of her family's name. Rumors spread like wildfire that the Sullivans believed they were chosen to conduct rituals of purification, that they fed on the suffering of innocents, that they were building some twisted covenant to ensure their fortune endured. The truth, buried in half-burned documents and silenced testimony, may never be known. What remained was the image of those children, chains clinking as they stumbled into daylight for the first time in years. From that day forward, The Sullivan estate was no longer a proud landmark but a cursed place. Travelers gave it wide berth, and locals swore they could still hear chains dragging on the earth whenever the wind turned cold. The story of the Sullivan basement became more than scandal. It became legend, whispered at firesides, a warning to children who strayed too far after dark. Some say the cries never truly ceased. Some say they still echo beneath the soil of Virginia, carried on the night air like a curse that refuses to die. The Sullivan estate stood like a sentinel at the edge of the valley, a red, bricked mansion with black shutters, perched on fertile land worked by enslaved hands. To most, it was a picture of Southern prosperity in 1834, tall tobacco stalks swaying in the fields, the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from its chimneys, and the sound of horses stamping in the stables. The family that ruled there, Thomas Sullivan and his wife Eleanor, were regarded as untouchable pillars of wealth and devotion. But beneath the polished veneer of their household lay whispers that would soon swell into horror. Chapter 1 begins with the unease already festering among the neighboring farmers. Over the past 2 years, children had gone missing from surrounding villages. Some disappeared on errands, others while wandering roads alone, and a few from within their own beds without explanation. Mothers clutched their sons tighter. Fathers sharpened their rifles, but no culprit was ever found. Rumors ran rampant. Some blamed roaming bandits. Others whispered of wild animals or of slave uprisings too terrible to voice aloud. Yet a persistent story lingered, that the cries of children could sometimes be heard drifting across the Sullivan fields at night, soft as the wind, and that the family's cellar was never to be approached. One humid summer evening, the first witness brave enough to speak came forward. A farmhand named Jacob, after lingering too long in the Sullivan orchards, swore he had heard voices beneath the earth, thin, desperate wails echoing through the soil. He told his master, who dismissed him, but Jacob's story spread like wildfire among the enslaved and the poor. A preacher passing through the valley took to his pulpit, warning that sin had taken root among the respectable. His sermon rattled the faithful, yet no one dared accuse the Sullivans openly. Their fortune reached judges, sheriffs, and landowners alike, and few wished to risk their livelihoods against such power. It was the disappearance of Samuel Rhodes, the blacksmith's son, that forced the whispers into action. Samuel was just 9, bright-eyed and well-loved. He vanished on a sunny morning after leaving to fetch water from the creek. His bucket was found overturned near the road that passed the Sullivan property. His mother swore she heard his voice crying out in the night, faint but unmistakable, calling from the direction of the estate. Distraught, she stormed onto the Sullivan land, beating at the front door with her fists and screaming for her boy. Eleanor Sullivan appeared, pale and serene, insisting she knew nothing of the matter. Neighbors dragged the mother away, but her wild cries planted a seed of doubt that grew in every heart. By late summer, 2 men, Thomas Briggs and Caleb Harper, resolved to uncover the truth. They were no heroes, whiskey had steeled their nerves, and both carried lanterns and cudgels more for bravado than courage. On a moonless night, they crept to the Sullivan estate. The mansion loomed silent, its shutters bolted tight. They avoided the front and circled to the cellar doors, heavy oak reinforced with iron. To their surprise, the lock was not secured. Briggs pushed, and the doors creaked open, exhaling a rush of damp air that stank of mildew, sweat, and something fouler still. Inside, their lantern light fell upon stone steps descending into suffocating darkness. The walls wept moisture, and the air was thick with rot. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, so faint they thought it their imagination, a rattle of chains followed by a whimper. Briggs nearly fled, but Harper pressed on, holding the lantern high. As they descended, the sound grew clearer, the shifting of metal, a cough, then a cry that cracked the stillness. The cellar opened into a wide chamber of rough stone, and there, in the wavering lantern glow, the truth revealed itself. Children, dozens of them, were chained to the walls in rows, iron collars fastened to their necks and wrists. Their faces were hollow, their bodies little more than skin stretched over bone. Some shielded their eyes from the light, having lived too long in darkness. Others stared, wide-eyed and silent, as though the sudden appearance of strangers had stolen their voices. There were 47 in all, boys and girls of varying ages, some scarcely 5, others nearing adolescence. Their clothes were tatters, their skin marked by welts and sores. One little girl reached out a trembling hand toward Harper, her voice rasping, "Police." The men stood frozen, struck dumb by the sheer impossibility of what they saw. The Sullivan family, pillars of church and community, had hidden a prison of innocence beneath their very home. Harper dropped his lantern. It struck the floor and rolled, casting frantic shadows across the stone. The children flinched as if from a blow. Briggs cursed, dragging Harper back up the steps in blind panic. They burst into the night, their screams ringing through the valley. Neighbors were roused from their beds by the sound, and soon a mob gathered at the Sullivan gates, armed with torches and farm tools, faces pale with fury and fear. When the cellar doors were thrown wide again, the crowd saw what Briggs and Harper had witnessed. Mothers collapsed in grief, fathers swore vengeance, and even the bravest men wept at the sight of the children stumbling into the open air. The Sullivans themselves emerged from the house, Thomas grim and silent, Eleanor pale and trembling. When pressed for answers, Thomas claimed ignorance, insisting the children had been left in their care by unseen benefactors. Eleanor wept, protesting innocence, but no one believed them. Their servants offered no defense, most looked as terrified as the children themselves. What happened that night is recorded only in fragments. Some say the crowd nearly hanged Thomas on the spot. Others claim he was dragged before a magistrate, only to escape punishment when records mysteriously vanished. What is certain is that the image of those 47 children, chains rattling as they stepped into the dawn, burned itself into the valley's memory. The Sullivan house, once admired, became a place of dread. The cellar was sealed, but locals swore that on quiet nights, cries could still be heard rising from beneath the soil. Some called it a haunting, others a curse laid upon the land. The truth was never fully explained. Why the children were taken, how long they had been kept, or what rituals, if any, the Sullivans performed in that underground chamber. The family's name was forever stained, and the valley carried the scar of their cruelty like a brand. Thus begins the descent into madness and legend, the tale of the Sullivan family, whose hidden basement turned respectability into infamy, and whose crimes birthed whispers that echo even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the morning after the cellar was opened. The valley no longer felt like the place its people had always known. A thick silence lay over the land, broken only by the rattling of chains as the last of the children were led from the Sullivan basement. The mob that had gathered in the night stood in disbelief, torches guttering in the dawn light. Hardened farmers, men who had survived wars and watched loved ones die in fever, wept openly. Mothers clutched the rescued children, searching for their own missing sons and daughters, only to realize that not all had been found. Word spread quickly beyond the valley. By noon, horsemen rode to the county seat, bearing news of a horror beneath the Sullivan estate. Sheriffs and magistrates were summoned, though many balked at the accusations. Thomas Sullivan was no vagrant or petty thief. He was a man of influence, his name etched into deeds and contracts across Virginia. To accuse him of chaining children in his cellar was to question the very foundations of order. Yet the testimony of dozens of witnesses and the sight of 47 emaciated bodies could not be ignored. The children themselves were taken into custody by townsfolk and churchmen. Some were too weak to speak, their lips cracked, eyes hollow with hunger. Others muttered incoherent fragments of darkness, of chanting, of strange rituals whispered in the blackness of the cellar. One little boy claimed that the lady of the house recited prayers over them each night, prayers not of salvation but of binding. A girl barely 7 spoke of being promised food only if she repeated certain phrases in unison with the others. Their stories, fragmented and strange, suggested something far worse than simple cruelty. Thomas Sullivan was arrested that same evening. The sheriff, pale and sweating, knocked on the mansion's great door with trembling hands. Thomas emerged in his black coat, his face unreadable, his posture as stiff and commanding as ever. He did not resist. Instead, he placed his hands behind his back as though submitting to a minor inconvenience. "This is a mistake," he told the sheriff. "You do not understand the work we have been doing. It is sacred." His words sent a shiver through the crowd, but no one dared speak. Eleanor Sullivan was taken as well, though she wept and clutched at her children, insisting she had no knowledge of the basement. Neighbors who had once admired her lace bonnets and polite smiles now looked at her with cold suspicion. Some spat at her feet as she was dragged away. The trial began swiftly, but it was unlike any trial the county had ever seen. The courthouse overflowed with spectators, their faces grim, their whispers thick with horror. Farmers pressed shoulders with merchants, slaves craned their necks from the gallery, and ministers sat stiff, backed in judgment. The Sullivan name, once a shield, was now a curse. The prosecutor laid out the case with shaking hands. He spoke of the cries heard in the night, of the mothers who had lost their children, of the terrible discovery in the cellar. Witness after witness took the stand. Briggs and Harper told their tale, their voices cracking as they described the rows of chained bodies. Mothers sobbed as they pointed to gaunt little figures now seated in the gallery, proof of their suffering. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, torn between outrage and fear. When Thomas Sullivan was called to speak, he did not deny the existence of the cellar nor the children. Instead, he claimed they had been chosen, gathered as part of a covenant older than the state itself. He spoke of purification, of inheritance, of assuring prosperity for generations. His words were not the defense of an innocent man, but the sermon of a zealot. Even the most skeptical jurors felt unease at his calm conviction. Eleanor, on the other hand, collapsed under questioning. She wept uncontrollably, claiming ignorance, insisting she had been forbidden to enter the cellar. "I never knew," she swore. "I never knew what he was doing." Some believed her, moved by her trembling form. Others whispered that she, too, had prayed over the chained children. Testimonies of survivors hinted at her presence in the basement. The truth remained clouded, wrapped in fear and confusion. The verdict seemed inevitable, guilty. Yet in the days that followed, something curious happened. Records of testimony vanished from the clerk's office. Witnesses who had spoken boldly began to falter, recant, or disappear entirely. The sheriff himself admitted under hushed tones that powerful men from Richmond had arrived, pressing for discretion. They argued that such a scandal would stain Virginia's reputation, unsettle landowners, and tarnish the church. Better to bury it quietly than let it fester. When the jury at last delivered its judgment, it shocked the valley. Thomas Sullivan was declared guilty of unlawful imprisonment, a charge far lighter than the people demanded. He was sentenced not to death, but to exile from the county. Eleanor was acquitted entirely. Gasps filled the courtroom. Mothers screamed curses. Fathers slammed their fists on benches. Yet the decision stood, protected by signatures no one dared to challenge. The Sullivans vanished soon after, escorted under cover of night. Some claimed they fled to another county. Others whispered they were spirited away by men of power, hidden from justice to continue their work. The 47 children were scattered. Some returned to grieving families, others placed in orphanages. A few too broken to survive long after their release. The estate itself was abandoned. Neighbors could not bear to claim the land. The cellar doors were sealed, but travelers who passed nearby spoke of hearing faint cries beneath the earth, chains rattling in the wind. Over time, the mansion fell into ruin, its shutters rotting, its bricks blackened by moss. Yet no one dared tear it down. It stood as a scar on the valley, a reminder of what had been uncovered, and of what had been concealed. By autumn, the story of the Sullivan basement had already slipped from official records. Newspapers printed cautious lines about alleged mistreatment, but avoided mention of the chained children. Preachers warned their flocks not to dwell on it, but the people of the valley did not forget. Around their hearths, they whispered of curses, of cries in the dark, of faces pressed to cellar cracks. Parents warned their children not to wander near the estate. Some swore the ghosts of the 47 still lingered there, bound by chains even after death. Thus, the Sullivan curse entered folklore, not as a matter of law, but as a tale told in hushed voices. It was a wound the valley would never heal, a truth buried by power but kept alive in whispers. And in those whispers lay a warning that even the most respectable names could mask horrors too dark to comprehend. When the cellar doors were torn open that summer night in 1834, 47 children emerged into the dawn, but they were not free in the way the crowd had imagined. Chains could be struck from their wrists, iron collars broken, but the shadows of that basement clung to them long after. The valley thought it had rescued innocence. What it had truly unleashed were voices heavy with secrets, testimonies that carried whispers of ritual, cruelty, and something darker than mere imprisonment. At first, the children were sheltered by families in town. Churches took some in, orphanages others. A few were claimed by frantic parents who had long prayed for miracles. But nearly half had no one to come forward. They had been missing for months, even years, and their origins were blurred. Some spoke of distant towns, names of villages unfamiliar to the valley. A few seemed unable to recall their pasts at all. They spoke instead of the cellar, as though their lives had begun and ended there. Doctors and ministers visited, hoping to bring both healing and clarity. The children's bodies bore the marks of neglect, malnourishment, bruises, sores from shackles rubbing skin raw. Yet their minds bore deeper scars. Some refused to speak at all, staring blankly at walls for hours. Others cried out in the night, screaming for food, for light, or for the lady's voice. What unsettled the doctors most were the fragments of testimony that slipped from trembling lips. One boy of about 10 insisted they had been gathered to sing the words that made the house safe. When asked what words, he recited a string of syllables foreign to any minister present, a chant that left even the hardened sheriff crossing himself. A girl whispered that each night Sullivan had come down the steps carrying a candle, her shadow tall against the stones. She prayed not for their rescue, but for their silence. She would hold the candle near their faces, telling them that if they repeated her words, the hunger would not come. Some of the younger children described rituals more clearly. They said they were forced to kneel in rows, collars biting into their necks, while Thomas spoke of sacrifices and bloodlines. He told us we were the offering. One child confessed in a broken voice. Another said Thomas promised that their suffering would make his family strong. That or pain was his gift. These statements spread like wildfire through the valley, fueling the belief that the Sullivans had been part of something unholy. Perhaps not merely cruelty, but witchcraft. The ministers recoiled, branding the words blasphemy. They claimed the children's minds had been poisoned by hunger and terror, twisting scripture into nightmares. But others, the farmers, the mothers who had lost their sons, believed every word. To them, the Sullivans were not just criminals, they were monsters, servants of something evil. Yet not all children condemned the family. A small number, perhaps 5 or 6, insisted the Sullivans had saved them. One boy, thin as a skeleton, told a minister that his parents had given him away willingly. They said I was chosen, he whispered, almost proudly. He claimed Thomas fed them, the food of strength, though his wasted frame betrayed otherwise. Another girl sobbed when separated from Eleanor, crying, "She is the only mother I know." These contradictions confused officials and enraged townsfolk. Were the children brainwashed? Or had some come to see their captors as protectors in their twisted reality? In the weeks after the discovery, the valley was plagued by unrest. The people wanted clarity, but the children's testimonies offered only more questions. Ministers tried to exorcise the fear with sermons, declaring that evil had been purged, that God's light had prevailed. But each time a child muttered a chant in the dark, or screamed of chains that still clinked in dreams, the congregation shivered. One night, a farmer's wife awoke to find the orphaned boy she had taken in kneeling by the hearth, chanting to the cold ashes as though waiting for a flame to rise. She struck him, demanding he stop, but he only wept and whispered, "If I don't, the lady will come back." Another child, fostered by a blacksmith, refused to sleep on a bed, curling instead on the hard floor with wrists crossed as though expecting chains. When pressed, he said, "That is how we were told the angels would find us." Rumors of hauntings began to circulate. Some claimed the children were cursed, their time in the cellar binding them to the darkness that had ruled there. Others whispered that the Sullivan family had not been exiled at all, but still lingered, drawing power through the children's memories. Whatever the truth, unease thickened like fog across the valley. By autumn, the surviving children had scattered. Some were sent to distant orphanages. A few were taken in by relatives in other states. But a core group remained in the valley, too fragile or too strange to send away. It was from these few that the darkest stories emerged in years to come. The boy who had once spoken proudly of being chosen died suddenly in his sleep. His lips cracked into a faint smile. A doctor declared it malnourishment, but the townsfolk swore he had been claimed by whatever covenant Thomas Sullivan had begun. Another child disappeared altogether, slipping from her foster home one night without a trace. Her tiny footprints were found leading back toward the Sullivan estate, ending abruptly at the cellar doors. Those doors, sealed with heavy chains, became a place of dread. Yet children, drawn by some unseen force, were found loitering near them, pressing their ears against the wood as though listening for familiar voices. One orphan admitted he still heard the choir singing beneath the ground and that it called to him in dreams. The valley, desperate to heal, tried to suppress these stories. Families were warned never to repeat the children's words, never to speak of chants or rituals. Ministers preached of forgiveness, urging people to leave the past buried. But buried things have a way of clawing back to the surface, and the testimonies of the Sullivan children lingered like scars across the community, deepening with every whisper of chains in the night. Thus, the children became not only victims but vessels of the curse. Their broken voices carried the memory of the cellar, ensuring that the horror could not be erased. For every survivor who healed, another faltered, dragging the shadow of the Sullivan name into the years beyond. The basement might have been sealed, the family exiled, but in the words of those who lived through it, the darkness endured. By the winter of 1834, the valley was no longer the same place it had been before the Sullivan cellar was opened. Once, it had been a land of harvest and prayer, where neighbors gathered for barn raisings and shared hymns on Sundays. Now, a shadow hung over every farmhouse and chapel pew. The people could not shake the sound of chains rattling in their memory, nor the sight of hollow-eyed children stumbling into the dawn. At first, there had been unity and outrage. Men and women alike demanded justice, demanding Thomas and Eleanor Sullivan be punished for their crimes. But when the trial ended with exile instead of execution, that unity shattered. Some accepted the ruling, saying the family's removal was punishment enough. Others saw it as betrayal, proof that power could twist truth, and that the lives of children mattered less than the names of the wealthy. The divide grew sharper as whispers of a curse spread. Farmers spoke of livestock born deformed, their limbs twisted, their cries strange. Crops withered in certain fields, even when the soil was rich and the weather kind. One preacher declared from his pulpit that God was punishing the valley for letting the Sullivans escape true justice. Another argued that the evil in the cellar had tainted the land itself, a wound that would never heal. Families began to fight among themselves. Some insisted the Sullivans had merely been cruel, human monsters who should be remembered with shame but not superstition. Others claimed the children's testimonies of chanting and ritual proved darker forces at play. These debates split congregations, taverns, even dinner tables. To believe the story one way was to mark yourself as rational. To believe it the other was to admit that the valley itself had been touched by something unnatural. The children who remained in the valley only fueled the divide. Some tried to live normal lives, adopted by kindly families who clothed and fed them. But trauma does not vanish with bread and blankets. Nightmares plagued many of them, loud enough to wake whole households. Some cried out in languages no one could recognize. Others whispered to invisible friends, or scratched strange symbols into wood and dirt. Their foster families grew afraid, torn between pity and dread. A few children were sent away quietly, for their own good. One boy, placed with a farmer named Isaac Turner, was found more than once wandering at night toward the Sullivan estate. When Isaac asked why, the boy replied, "The master calls me back." Isaac beat the answer from him, but the boy only grew more determined to return. One stormy night he vanished altogether, his trail ending at the chained cellar doors. No one saw him again. Isaac swore the boy had been claimed by the curse, while others accused Isaac of killing him to end his burden. The truth was never known. As winter deepened, the Sullivan house itself became the valley's darkest landmark. Abandoned after the family's exile, it stood silent on the hill, its black shutters rattling in the wind. No one would go near it after dusk. Travelers who passed by swore they heard cries rising from beneath the ground, or saw pale faces watching from the broken windows. Some claimed to smell smoke, though no fire burned within. The sheriff, pressured by fearful townsfolk, ordered the cellar sealed with iron chains. But the sealing only gave rise to new legends, that the evil had been bound inside, straining to break free. Children of the valley dared each other to approach the house. Some returned pale and trembling, swearing they heard voices whispering their names. Others laughed, declaring it nothing but creaks and shadows. Yet even the bravest refused to linger long, for the silence of that place was heavy, unnatural, as though the earth itself groaned under its weight. The story began to travel beyond the valley. Peddlers carried it to nearby towns, exaggerating details as they went. Soon, whispers of the Sullivan curse reached taverns in Richmond and even the docks of Norfolk. In some versions, the children had been sacrificed outright. In others, they had been fed to spirits dwelling beneath the soil. Each telling grew darker, but the kernel of truth, the basement of chained innocence, remained constant, seeding fear wherever it spread. Meanwhile, in the valley, families began to leave. A handful packed wagons and fled westward, saying the land was poisoned. Their farms lay abandoned, left to weeds and wild animals. Those who stayed behind grew more insular, mistrustful of outsiders and even of their own neighbors. They no longer spoke freely of the Sullivans, but the name lingered in every silence, like a wound people refused to probe yet could not forget. The ministers tried to reclaim authority, preaching of redemption and warning against superstition. They urged the people to bury the past, to trust in God's judgment, not whispers of curses. Yet the ministers themselves seemed uneasy. More than one admitted in private that the children's testimonies had shaken them deeply. One confessed that when he prayed at night, he sometimes heard the echo of voices repeating the chants the children had spoken, as if those words had seeped into the very soil. By spring, the valley was fractured. On one side stood those who sought to dismiss the curse, clinging to reason and law. On the other stood those who believed the valley was doomed, its fate bound to the horrors once hidden in that basement. Neither side could silence the other, and both lived under the same shadow. The children themselves were caught between. They carried the memory of chains, of hunger, of whispered rituals. Some healed enough to live ordinary lives, though the past always haunted them. Others never escaped, their minds bound as tightly as their wrists had once been. They became living reminders of the Sullivan name, proof that the cellar had been real, and that what was chained below the earth might still linger in the marrow of the valley. The Sullivan estate stood as a monument to fear, its silence louder than any sermon. And though the family had vanished, the curse they left behind grew roots in the valley's soil, spreading through rumor, memory, and the cries of children who could never forget the darkness from which they had been dragged. It was no longer just a story of cruelty. It was the making of a legend, one that would echo for generations, whispered on stormy nights and around winter hearths. For the valley had learned that evil does not die with exile, nor does it fade with silence. It waits patient as the earth itself beneath the chained cellar doors of the Sullivan house. A decade had passed since the cellar doors were first torn open, yet the shadow of the Sullivan estate had not faded. If anything, it had grown darker with time, fed by the whispers of every child who vanished, every strange sound in the night, every crop that failed without reason. By 1844, the valley was no longer remembered for its fertile soil or church bells, but for the lingering presence of a curse that refused to die. The Sullivan mansion stood abandoned, its windows shattered, its roof sagging. Ivy clawed up its red brick walls, and the land around it grew wild with weeds. But the cellar doors remained sealed, heavy chains rusting in the damp air. No one dared break them, though some swore the locks themselves shifted at night, as if tugged from the inside. Travelers avoided the road that ran past the estate. Horses balked when led near the gates, eyes rolling white, nostrils flaring as though scenting something unnatural. The valley's people tried to go on with their lives. New farms were tilled, children were born, sermons were preached. Yet even in ordinary days the curse whispered. A farmer's cow would calve stillborn, and neighbors would murmur that the Sullivan spirits had touched it. A child would wake screaming from a nightmare, claiming to see chains in the dark, and mothers would shiver, remembering the cellar. It was not only memory that kept the legend alive, it was the strange events that continued to unfold. In the winter of 1837, 3 years after the Sullivans' exile, a girl named Mary Fletcher disappeared from her bed. Her family searched the snowfields until their feet bled, but no tracks were found beyond her window. Days later, a group of hunters swore they saw her pale figure near the Sullivan estate, wandering barefoot in the frost, her eyes blank as a doll's. When they pursued, she vanished into the shadows. Mary was never seen again. In 1839, a young man named Jacob Carter dared his friends to enter the mansion. They were boys barely on the cusp of manhood, eager to prove their courage. With torches in hand, they pried open a shutter and climbed inside. At first, the house seemed only a ruin, dust thick on the floors, mice scurrying in the walls. But as they crept closer to the cellar door, a sound rose from below, faint, metallic like chains dragged across stone. Terrified, the boys fled, but Jacob, stubborn, lingered a moment longer. He claimed later that he saw a face staring up through the cracks, gaunt, pale, and childlike, though its eyes burned with something older. Jacob never spoke of it again, but his hair turned gray within a year, though he was not yet 20. Such stories multiplied. A midwife claimed she heard children's laughter echoing in the fields near the estate, though no children were present. A traveling peddler refused to stay the night in the valley, saying he saw little hands clawing at the shutters of the abandoned house. A schoolteacher found strange markings scratched into her desk, identical to the symbols the Sullivan children had once scrawled into the dirt. The valley became a place of dread for outsiders. Travelers hurried through, avoiding eye contact with locals. Merchants raised their prices, claiming the land was unclean. Even the church struggled. Ministers thundered against superstition, demanding their congregations trust in God alone. Yet their voices carried little weight when their own parishioners confessed to hearing voices in the night, or to dreaming of the cellar no matter how fervently they prayed. The surviving Sullivan children were grown now, or nearly so. Some had left the valley, trying to escape the past. Others remained, shadows of themselves, haunted by what they had endured. A few spoke openly of their time in the cellar, telling fragments of ritual and suffering. Their words only deepened the sense of unease. One young woman, who had been only 6 when rescued, confessed to her foster mother that she still felt Eleanor Sullivan watching her in dreams, whispering prayers over her bed. "She says I still belong to her," the girl murmured. Not long after, she vanished in the night, leaving her bed neatly made. By 1842, the valley had become obsessed with the idea of the Sullivan curse. Some families carried charms or nailed horseshoes above their doors, hoping to ward off evil. Others refused to speak the family's name, believing that to do so might call the spirits closer. On stormy nights, neighbors huddled together, swearing they heard the cries of children carried on the wind. The cellar had become not just a memory but a living wound, bleeding into every life in the valley. Yet, for all their fear, no one dared destroy the house. Some argued it should be burned, that fire might cleanse the land. But each time the idea was raised, something prevented it. Tools broke, fires refused to catch, men lost their nerve at the gate. It was as though the mansion itself resisted destruction, clinging to the earth with roots deeper than stone. The legend grew with every passing year. Parents warned their children never to wander alone, lest the curse claim them. Strangers passing through told tales of ghostly children leading travelers astray. In taverns, old men swore they had seen the figures of Thomas and Eleanor themselves, standing in the windows of the ruined house, watching with cold eyes. Some claimed the family had never truly left, that exile was only a cover for something worse. That they had died, yes, but their spirits lingered, fed by the cries of the 47. By the 10th anniversary, the Sullivan story had become less a history than a legend, shaped by fear and retelling. Yet for those who had been there, who had heard the chains rattle, who had carried the children from the darkness, there was no exaggeration needed. They knew the truth had been worse than the rumors, and that the valley would never be free of it. For evil does not end when a door is sealed. It lingers, in memory, in whispers, in the cries of children carried by the wind. And in the Valley of Virginia, 1844, the Sullivan curse was no longer merely a story. It was a way of life. By 1847, the valley had grown tired of waiting for peace that never came. The Sullivan estate still loomed in silence, its cellar sealed but restless, while the whispers of curses stretched into every season. But it was news from beyond the valley that stirred old fears anew. For though the Sullivans had been exiled over a decade ago, their name began to surface again, in places far from Virginia, where the soil carried its own shadows. The first rumor arrived by way of a traveling merchant. He claimed that in the mountains of North Carolina, a settlement had uncovered strange practices tied to a family bearing the Sullivan name. Children were seen wandering roads barefoot, their eyes hollow. Locals spoke of a large farmhouse where voices rose at night in chants not heard before. At first, the valley dismissed the tale as exaggeration, for merchants thrived on the drama of their stories. But when a second report came, this time from a circuit preacher, the people listened more closely. The preacher had stopped in a small North Carolina village called Ash Hollow. There, he said, he found whispers of a holy family, who lived apart, on a sprawling property at the edge of the woods. The people of Ash Hollow spoke of nightly rituals, of children being taken in for the covenant. The preacher swore he saw a woman, thin pale, with hair black as coal, leading a line of children across a field at dusk, their hands clasped as though in prayer. When he asked who she was, the villagers replied with one name only: Eleanor Sullivan. The valley erupted when the tale spread. Had she survived? Had the exile been a ruse, allowing the Sullivans to continue their work elsewhere? Or was it another family entirely, cursed to bear the same name? No one could answer with certainty, but the resemblance in details was too strong to ignore. And so, the legend that had taken root in Virginia began to spread outward, tying new places into its shadow. In Ash Hollow, rumors deepened. A farmer claimed his niece had vanished after visiting the Sullivan house, only to reappear weeks later, pale and silent, refusing to speak of where she had been. Another told of finding strange symbols carved into trees near the property, matching those the rescued children of Virginia had once scratched into the dirt. Most chilling of all was a tale of voices heard at night. Children's voices, chanting in unison, drifting from the woods like a hymn-turned sower. Back in Virginia, those who had lived through the cellar horror felt a grim confirmation. The curse had not been confined to their valley. It had followed the Sullivans, spreading like rot through new soil. And if Eleanor had indeed rebuilt her covenant in North Carolina, then the 47 children had been only the beginning. Not everyone believed. Some dismissed the stories as hysteria, a recycling of old fears in new places. But those who had once heard the cries beneath the Sullivan house could not dismiss the parallels. A group of men even spoke of traveling south, determined to see for themselves. But one by one they abandoned the plan, their courage faltering under the weight of the unknown. The Sullivans had already escaped justice once. What chance would common farmers have if they truly commanded the dark forces the children had described? By 1848, the Ash Hollow rumors had grown darker still. Entire families whispered of lights burning in the Sullivan windows through the night, though no fire or lamp should have lasted so long. Hunters swore they saw children moving silently through the forest, their faces pale, their eyes unblinking. A miller claimed he passed the Sullivan property at dawn and saw Eleanor herself kneeling in the yard, her hands red with blood, though whether animal or human he dared not guess. The preacher who had first brought the story returned to Virginia once more. This time, his voice trembled with fear. "I tell you," he said before a packed congregation, "what we witnessed in 1834 has taken root again. And if it is not stopped, it will spread beyond Virginia, beyond Carolina, until every corner of this country bears its shadow." The congregation sat silent, haunted by his words. But no one rose to act. Memories of the cellar were still too raw. The fear of stirring its curse was stronger than the will to fight it. The people prayed, but their prayers were laced with doubt, for they knew the Sullivans had not been defeated. They had only moved on. As the years passed, the legend grew, now tethered to two places: the valley in Virginia, where chains had first rattled, and Ash Hollow, where the Sullivans were said to live anew. Travelers avoided both, muttering that children vanished on roads leading to either place. Tales spread of ghostly processions of little ones walking silently in the moonlight, led by a woman with coal, black hair, and a candle in her hand. The Sullivan name had become more than a family. It had become a symbol of something unending. Whether Thomas and Eleanor still lived in flesh, or whether their spirits wandered from place to place, no one could say. But one truth settled into every heart that remembered the cellar had only been the beginning. And so, the valley learned a bitter lesson. Evil is not confined by walls or doors, nor by chains and exile. It moves with those who carry it, seeking new ground, new victims, new prayers to twist into curses. The Sullivan family had been driven from Virginia, but their shadow had not been driven from the world. It lingered still, in Ash Hollow, in memory, and in every whispered fear that the sound of children chanting in the dark was not a dream but a warning. Ash Hollow, North Carolina, 1849. The settlement was small, tucked into the shadow of pine-covered ridges, its cabins clustered around a creek that ran swift and cold. The people of Ash Hollow were used to hard winters and lean harvests, but nothing had prepared them for the strange hold that one family had begun to exert over their valley. They lived apart, at the far edge of the forest, on a property larger than most, its fields eerily untended yet always green. The locals whispered of them as the strangers from Virginia. Others dared speak their name, the Sullivans. By now, everyone in Ash Hollow had heard some fragment of rumor. Children seen walking in silence after dark. Animals found drained of blood. A line of candles burning in the windows of the Sullivan house from dusk until dawn. And above all, the haunting sound of voices, high, childlike voices, chanting in unison, their words unintelligible, drifting from the trees at night. At first, the villagers dismissed it as foolishness. But when young Samuel Green vanished in the spring, the stories turned darker. He had been seen last at the edge of the woods, chasing after a stray lamb. Days later, his mother claimed to hear him calling her name in the night, though when she ran to the door, no one stood outside. Then the farmer who went searching claimed he found small handprints pressed into the mud by the Sullivan fence, too many to belong to a single child. Samuel never returned. Fear turned to anger and anger to resolve. A group of men, hardened farmers and hunters, decided they would see the truth for themselves. Among them was Elias Carter, who had kin in Virginia and had heard the cellar stories firsthand. He urged caution, but the others scoffed. "They're just people," one man said, tightening his grip on his musket. "And if they've taken our children, they'll answer for it." The men set out one moonless night, their torches smoldering low, their boots sinking into the soft earth. They followed the creek until the trees thickened, then cut across the fields toward the Sullivan house. It rose from the dark like a blackened silhouette, taller than any farmhouse should be, its windows glowing faintly with candlelight. As they drew nearer, a sound met their ears, a steady rhythm, voices chanting in time, carried by the wind. The men froze. It was not the hymn of any church they knew. The words twisted harsh and low, yet threaded with the high, sweet tones of children. Elias felt his stomach turn. He had heard something like it once before, long ago, seeping through the cellar doors in Virginia. Still, they pressed on. Reaching the edge of the Sullivan yard, they crouched in the tall grass, their eyes fixed on the scene before them. The front door of the house stood open, spilling a glow onto the yard. Figures emerged. First a line of children, pale and barefoot, their white gowns fluttering in the night air. They moved in eerie unison, their faces blank, their eyes reflecting the torchlight like glass. Behind them came a woman, tall and thin, her long black hair loose over her shoulders. In her hand she carried a single candle, its flame unbroken despite the breeze. "Eleanor," Elias whispered, his throat dry. The others stared, their bravado faltering. She looked exactly as she had been described 15 years before in Virginia, unchanged, untouched by time. Her pale face glowed in the candlelight, her lips moving silently though her voice carried with the children's. As she raised her free hand, the line of children stopped, then knelt in the grass as one. Their chanting grew louder, filling the night. The men gripped their weapons. One, a burly farmer named Harlan, stood suddenly, rage overcoming fear. He roared, lifting his musket. The chant faltered. Eleanor's head turned sharply, her black eyes fixing on the intruders in the grass. In that instant, the air grew heavy, pressing down on the men's chests. The children rose as one, their pale faces turned toward the hunters. Not a word was spoken, yet the sense of being surrounded grew unbearable. Elias felt his heart hammering, sweat pouring down his back. "Shoot!" Harlan shouted, and fired. The musket cracked, smoke curling into the night. The shot tore through Eleanor's figure, yet she did not fall. Instead, the candle she held flared, its flame leaping higher as though swallowing the bullet's force. Her lips curved into a cold, thin smile. The children's chant resumed, louder, faster, the words pounding like a drumbeat. One by one, the other men tried to fire, but their powder dampened, their flints sparking uselessly. Only Elias held back, his hands trembling, the memory of Virginia screaming in his mind, the cellar, the chains, the 47. He knew what they faced was not mortal. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, the air filling with the sound of rattling chains, though none were visible. The men staggered, their torches flickering wildly. Some dropped their weapons and ran, vanishing into the dark. Harlan cursed and tried to reload, but his hands shook too violently. Eleanor stepped forward, her candle casting a circle of light that seemed to push the night away. "You should not have come," she said, her voice calm, almost tender, yet carrying to every ear. "The covenant is not for you." Then she raised her hand again, and the children turned in perfect unison, their gazes fixed on the intruders. The chant rose to a piercing crescendo. Elias clamped his hands over his ears, but it was not sound he heard. It was inside his head, echoing in his bones. He saw flashes, chains clinking in darkness, the wide eyes of starving children, the cellar swallowing him whole. When Elias came to his senses, the yard was empty. The men who had come with him were gone, vanished without a trace, their torches extinguished. Only he remained, kneeling in the grass, gasping for air. The Sullivan house stood silent, its door closed, its windows dark. He stumbled back to Ash Hollow alone, half mad with fear. When he told his story, many refused to believe. But some saw the truth in his eyes, the way his hands shook, the way his hair had whitened in a single night. And though no one could prove what had happened to the missing men, the valley whispered one explanation. They had been taken into the covenant. From that night onward, none dared approach the Sullivan property again. The sound of chanting continued, drifting across the fields at midnight, carried by the wind. Children vanished, animals died, and the house stood untouched, its dark windows watching. The curse of Virginia had not ended. It had only moved south, growing stronger with every soul it claimed. By the year 1851, Ash Hollow was no longer simply a quiet settlement in the Carolina woods. It had become the stage for something stranger, darker, and far more organized than the simple whispers of witchcraft or wandering spirits. What had begun as rumors of chanting in the night now showed itself boldly in the light of day. The Sullivan family, once exiled from Virginia, had not only survived, they had begun to flourish. At the center of it all was Eleanor Sullivan. Those who had seen her 15 years earlier swore she had not aged a single day. Her pale skin, long black hair, and cold, piercing eyes remained untouched by time. Where once she was whispered of as a mother who had led children into chains, now she presented herself as something else entirely, a vessel of divine purpose. She called herself the voice of the covenant, claiming visions had been given to her from beyond the mortal world. She did not preach from church pulpits. Instead, she gathered followers in fields or in the shadow of her house, her voice carrying like silk over stone. She spoke not of hellfire, but of freedom. Freedom from the rigid laws of men, from the hypocrisy of ministers, from the suffering of children in a world that did not care for them. She promised a higher order, a family of the chosen, where no child would ever hunger, where no soul would be forgotten. And people listened. Not all, of course. Many in Ash Hollow shunned her entirely, whispering that she was a witch, a devil cloaked in beauty. But others, especially the desperate, the poor, the grieving, began to drift toward her. A mother who had lost her baby in childbirth swore Eleanor's touch gave her peace. A farmer drowning in debt claimed he was reborn after hearing her speak. And most dangerous of all, children themselves wandered to her door, drawn like moths to flame, slipping away from their homes to join the ranks of her covenant. She welcomed them all. In time, her gatherings swelled. What had once been secretive, candlelit rituals in the night became processions through the fields. At dusk, villagers would hear the sound of feet marching, soft voices chanting, and see dozens of figures, men, women, and above all children, moving in perfect unison behind Eleanor, their hands clasped, their eyes fixed ahead. She carried a single candle, its flame unbroken, and proclaimed herself a prophetess of a new age. Her sermons, if they could be called that, were laced with both comfort and menace. She spoke of a world where families were shackles, where laws were cages, where only the covenant could provide true freedom. She promised that those who joined her would never fear hunger, death, or abandonment. And then, with a smile that chilled her listeners, she warned that those who rejected the covenant would be left in the darkness when the light comes. By 1852, Ash Hollow had begun to split. Some families embraced Eleanor as a savior, abandoning church and tradition to follow her. Others cursed her name, keeping their children locked indoors after dusk. Fistfights broke out in the tavern between neighbors. The settlement, once united by hardship, was now fractured by fear and faith. It was not only the villagers who noticed. Travelers passing through the region spoke of the strange sect in Ash Hollow, where a woman who never aged led children in midnight hymns. Some compared it to the Shakers or other fringe sects springing up across the country. Others whispered it was darker, closer to sorcery than salvation. Ministers from neighboring towns tried to intervene, traveling to Ash Hollow to preach against Eleanor. But each left in defeat, shaken by her calm gaze, unsettled by the fervor of her followers. What made Eleanor's covenant terrifying was not simply its growth, but the way it blurred the line between the living and the dead. for even as new children joined her ranks, stories spread that the voices of those long dead, perhaps even the 47 from Virginia, still chanted among them. Farmers working late in the fields claimed they heard more voices than there were bodies, as though the air itself joined in the ritual. Some swore the children's faces changed as they marched, flickering between the living and the pale visages of the lost. Eleanor herself never denied it. When asked about the dead, she only smiled. "The covenant is one," she would say. "Those who were, those who are, and those yet to come, all belong." Her reach spread beyond Ash Hollow. Families from neighboring settlements began to drift into her orbit, drawn by curiosity or desperation. Some stayed a night and fled, unnerved by the intensity of the rituals. Others stayed forever, vanishing into the Sullivan estate, their names never again appearing in local records. The population of the covenant swelled, its members bound not by blood but by devotion. And yet, for all the whispers of witchcraft, Eleanor's power seemed untouchable. The law turned a blind eye, whether out of ignorance, fear, or corruption. Ministers thundered from pulpits, but their words fell hollow beside the sight of children marching under the moonlight, their voices raised in unearthly harmony. Ash Hollow was no longer simply haunted. It was transformed. Where once the fear had been of shadows and whispers, now it was of a woman who stood openly in daylight, proclaiming herself prophetess and daring anyone to deny her. She had turned her family's curse into a creed, her crimes into commandments, her madness into a movement. And still, the memory of Virginia lingered. The few who remembered the cellar whispered that this was only the beginning. If Eleanor had chained 47 children once, what might she do now, with an entire valley willing to follow her? By the autumn of 1853, the covenant had spread its reach to neighboring counties. Processions were seen on forest roads, candles bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps. Travelers vanished more frequently. Entire households uprooted themselves to join the chosen, and Eleanor, radiant and untouched by time, stood at the center, holding her candle high, the flame never dimming. What she preached was simple and terrifying. There is no death in the covenant, only the promise of light. Come and be mine. And they did. The year was 1854 when Samuel Pritchard, a journalist from Richmond, arrived in Ash Hollow. He was a man of 35, thin and sharp, featured with ink-stained fingers and a restless mind. He had made his career reporting on scandals, political corruption, church disputes, tales of frontier violence. But when rumors of the Sullivan Covenant reached his desk, he knew he had found something stranger than any courtroom scandal. At first, he thought it superstition exaggerated by country folk. He had read about the Sullivan family in old clippings, brief articles about the Virginia cellar, children chained, a family exiled in disgrace. The details were thin, blurred by secrecy and shame. But if the same family had resurfaced in Carolina, and if whispers of ritual and prophecy were true, it would be the story of his career. He arrived in Ash Hollow on a warm September afternoon. The village seemed ordinary enough at first glance, fields dotted with haystacks, cabins with smoke rising from chimneys, children playing by the creek. Yet beneath the surface was a tension he could feel in every glance. Some villagers avoided his eye, muttering when they learned his business. Others leaned close, eager to spill their stories, lowering their voices as though the air itself might betray them. It did not take long for him to hear Eleanor's name. "Prophetess? She calls herself," one woman whispered, clutching her shawl tighter. "Preaches out in the open now, bold as you please." They march, all of them, even little ones, like soldiers behind her. Candles, songs, strange words none of us know. Another spat on the ground, his face twisted with bitterness. Half the town's already hers. The other half too scared to stop her. "You write your stories, sir, but don't expect us to save you if you wander too close." Intrigued, Samuel set about observing. By day, the Sullivans' property looked like any other, a farmhouse with wide fields beyond. But at night, the atmosphere changed. From his lodging on the edge of town, he could see faint flickers of light in the distance, candles moving like fireflies across the fields. Sometimes he heard voices carried by the wind, high and sweet, children singing in unison. The melodies sent chills through him, though the words were indistinguishable. Determined, he began keeping a journal. He wrote down every story, every rumor, every name. He interviewed the families of children who had vanished, 12 in the past 3 years by his count. Some parents whispered their children had chosen the covenant. Others wept and insisted they had been stolen. In each case, the trail ended at the Sullivan property. Finally, Samuel resolved to see Eleanor for himself. On a moonlit night, he followed a procession. Hidden in the trees, he watched as more than 50 people walked silently behind Eleanor Sullivan. They carried candles, their flames steady despite the wind. At their center were children, dozens of them, some no older than 5 or 6, their eyes fixed ahead. Eleanor led them, her black hair unbound, a single candle in her hand. Her face glowed with serenity, untouched by age. He strained to hear her words. "The covenant is eternal," she intoned, her voice carrying. "The children of light shall not know hunger, nor death, nor abandonment. We are one, past, present, and to come. All who walk in darkness will be left behind." Her followers murmured in agreement, their chant swelling into a hymn like cadence. The sound rooted Samuel to the spot. He had attended countless sermons, but never had he heard such devotion, so fierce and unified. These were not frightened peasants. These were believers, wholly surrendered to her. For several nights Samuel returned, always hidden, always scribbling furiously into his notebook. He recorded the chants, the rituals, the strange symbols painted on banners carried by the children. He noted the uncanny discipline of the group, how they moved in unison, how their torches never faltered. And always at the center was Eleanor, unchanged, unshaken. But as the days passed, he began to sense he was being watched. Once, while writing in his room, he glanced up to see a boy standing outside his window, barefoot, pale, staring with unblinking eyes. When Samuel rushed outside, the yard was empty, the grass undisturbed. Another time, he woke at dawn to find his journal moved from his bedside to the table across the room. No one else had entered. Yet the candle he had left unlit now burned low, wax pooled on the wood. The villagers warned him to leave. "She knows you're here," one farmer told him grimly. "She always knows. Best get out before you find yourself in her covenant too." But Samuel's determination hardened. He resolved not only to record the covenant, but to confront Eleanor herself. With a borrowed horse, he rode to the Sullivan estate one morning. The sun hung low, mist curling over the fields. The farmhouse stood silent, its shutters closed, its air heavy with stillness. He dismounted, notebook in hand, and approached the door. It opened before he could knock. Eleanor stood there, candle in hand, though the daylight shone. She smiled, as though expecting him. "Mr. Pritchard," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "You have been writing about us." Samuel's throat tightened. "I'm here to learn the truth." Her smile widened. "The truth? You already know it. You've seen it in the fields. You've heard it in the voices. The covenant is eternal. You may write it down if it comforts you, but the world will not believe you. Not until it belongs to us." Behind her, in the shadows of the house, he saw movement. Children, dozens of them. Their faces pale, their eyes shining. They watched him silently, as though waiting for him to join their ranks. For the first time, Samuel felt real fear. He backed away, muttering something about returning another time. Eleanor only laughed softly. "You will return," she said. "They always do." That night, Samuel fled Ash Hollow, but his journals remained, packed with notes and sketches, proof of what he had seen. He vowed to publish them, to warn the wider world. Yet as he traveled back to Richmond, strange things began to happen. His horse refusing to go on certain roads, his papers shifting in his bag, whispers in the dark when no one was near. He told himself it was nerves, exhaustion. But deep inside, he knew Eleanor had been right. He had seen the covenant, and once you saw it, it never let you go. By the winter of 1855, Samuel Pritchard's name was whispered in taverns, parlors, and printing offices from Richmond to Philadelphia. His journals, filled with fevered notes and sketches from Ash Hollow, had begun to circulate, though he himself had vanished. Some said he disappeared on the road home, his horse found riderless, his bags torn open. Others claimed he reached Richmond but was silenced by unseen hands before he could print his findings. Whatever the truth, his pages survived, and they spread like fire. The journals were unlike anything the American public had seen. Pritchard had recorded sermons word for word. Drawn the symbols he saw painted on banners, described the candlelit processions of children in eerie, mechanical unison. He wrote of Eleanor Sullivan herself, pale and ageless, declaring herself the voice of the covenant. His words dripped with fear and fascination, painting her not merely as a woman but as something eternal, beyond mortal bounds. Printers who dared publish excerpts sold out within days. Ministers thundered from pulpits, calling the covenant the work of the devil. Ordinary families whispered of protecting their children, locking doors tighter at night, warning one another of strangers who might coax little ones away. But with every warning, curiosity grew. Who was Eleanor Sullivan? Was she a prophetess, a witch, or something worse? And then, as if to answer, the covenant began to appear outside Ash Hollow. By the spring of 1856, reports came from Tennessee, Kentucky, even as far as Ohio, processions of candle-bearing children moving silently through fields, a tall woman leading them. Her face hidden in shadow but her voice carrying on the wind. Families vanished overnight, cabins left empty with food still on the tables. Travelers swore they saw ghostly figures on the roadside, lines of barefoot children who disappeared when approached. The press fueled the panic. Pritchard's journals were republished in pamphlets and broadsheets, each adding their own embellishments. Some called Eleanor a fraud, a mere conwoman. Others insisted she was immortal, her covenant the work of the devil himself. But whether skeptics or believers, all agreed the sightings were spreading. In Washington, lawmakers dismissed the stories as hysteria. Yet even there, rumors reached their ears. A senator's niece vanished while traveling in Maryland, days later. A farmer claimed to see her among a line of chanting children in Pennsylvania. The senator never spoke of it publicly, but his sudden resignation that summer stirred further speculation. Meanwhile, Ash Hollow itself changed. Those who resisted Eleanor dwindled, either leaving or succumbing to her influence. By 1857, the town was effectively hers. Visitors described it as eerily quiet by day, its residents polite but vacant-eyed. At night, however, the valley glowed with candlelight, the hymns of the covenant echoing across the hills. Few outsiders stayed long. Most who came left shaken, convinced they had glimpsed something not of this world. But perhaps the most disturbing part was the children. Pritchard had written that the covenant's chants contained more voices than bodies present, that the dead from Virginia marched alongside the living. Now, in towns hundreds of miles away, witnesses reported the same. Processions of 30 children sounded like hundreds. Faces seemed to shift in the flickering light, pale visages of long, dead little ones mingling with the living. Parents who lost children decades before claimed to hear their voices again, calling from the night. By the late 1850s, the Sullivan Covenant was no longer a rumor confined to backwoods valleys. It had become a national specter. Ministers preached against it. Newspapers mocked it, and yet sightings only increased. Some families uprooted themselves to join willingly, convinced Eleanor offered salvation. Others fought to resist, but their children slipped away regardless, drawn by an unseen call. The journals of Samuel Pritchard, meanwhile, took on a life of their own. In one particularly chilling passage he had written, "They told me once that the covenant is not bound to place or time. I believe them now. The cellar was never a prison, it was a seed. And what I see in Ash Hollow is not the fruit. It is the root, burrowing, spreading unseen. If you read this, understand, it cannot be stopped, only delayed. For the children are its branches, and there is no end to them." Those words were reprinted endlessly, fueling the belief that the Sullivan curse was not merely a family but a contagion of faith and fear. By 1860, processions of candle-bearing children were reported in nearly every state east of the Mississippi. Some were proven hoaxes, frightened townsfolk or cruel pranksters. But others defied explanation. Entire communities swore to the same details: the pale woman with the black hair, the never-dimming candle, the chants that echoed with more voices than mouths. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 briefly overshadowed the covenant. Yet even amidst the chaos of battle, soldiers told stories of phantom processions crossing fields at night, of hearing children's hymns in the smoke of cannon fire. Whether hallucinations born of stress or something darker, the stories persisted. The Sullivan Covenant had become not just a legend, but a national haunting, and through it all, Eleanor remained. Unseen directly by most, but always described the same by those who claimed to witness her: ageless, pale, her eyes reflecting both tenderness and terror, a candle always in hand. She did not die, she did not fade, she only spread, by the close of the decade. One truth had settled deep into the American imagination: the Sullivan curse had escaped the cellar, escaped Virginia, escaped even Ash Hollow. It was everywhere now, woven into the land itself. Parents still told their children not to wander after dark. Travelers still quickened their pace when candles flickered in distant fields. And though ministers thundered and skeptics scoffed, None could shake the fear that the covenant was waiting, patient, eternal. For evil does not die with exile. It grows, it spreads, it wears the face of salvation. And in the dark corners of America, in every whisper of chains, in every pale child glimpsed at the roadside, the voice of Eleanor Sullivan still called. There is no death in the covenant. Only the promise of light. Come and be mine!